Every day, headlines talk about inflation, recessions, unemployment, interest rates, stock market crashes, economic booms. But have you ever wondered what actually connects all of these together? Welcome back to The True Analyst. Thank you for joining me today for this comprehensive introduction to macroeconomics. Whether you're a student preparing for exams, a professional trying to understand policy changes, an investor tracking markets, or simply someone curious about how economies function, this session will give you a powerful framework to understand the world around you. Macroeconomics is not about one company, one product, or one consumer. It's about the economy as a whole. Why do some countries grow rapidly while others struggle? Why do recessions happen? Why does inflation suddenly make everything expensive? Why do governments change interest rates and taxes? Today, we'll answer all of these questions. We'll explore the major concerns policymakers worry about, understand how money and resources flow through the economy, examine the tools governments use to stabilize growth, and learn from some of history's biggest economic events. By the end of this session, economic news will start making far more sense to you. So let's begin. Before diving in, let's quickly map out our journey. We'll begin by understanding the critical difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics, because that distinction changes the entire way economists think about markets. Then we'll explore two foundational ideas: sticky prices and aggregate behavior, concepts that explain why entire economies can suddenly slow down even when individual markets appear functional. From there, we'll dive into the three major macroeconomic concerns: output growth, unemployment, inflation, and deflation. These three variables influence almost every policy decision made by governments and central banks. Next, we'll understand how the economy actually functions through the circular flow model and the three market arenas: the systems connecting households, firms, governments, and the rest of the world. And finally, we'll examine the role of government, especially fiscal policy and monetary policy, the two most powerful tools used to manage economic instability. So if you've ever watched news about GDP growth, recessions, interest rates, or inflation, and wondered what it all really means, this session is going to connect all the dots. Let's begin with one of the most important distinctions in all of economics. Microeconomics and macroeconomics may sound similar, but they study completely different scales of economic behavior. Think of microeconomics as looking through a microscope. Microeconomics focuses on individual units of the economy, individual firms, individual industries, and individual households. For example, how is the price of coffee determined? Why are smartphones expensive? How does one company maximize profits? How does one consumer decide what to buy? Microeconomics studies supply and demand in specific markets. It assumes that prices are generally flexible. If there's too much supply of apples, the price falls until buyers return and markets clear. The main objective here is efficient allocation of scarce resources. Now let's zoom out dramatically. Macroeconomics studies the entire economy at once. Instead of the price of one product, we study the overall price level. Instead of one company's production, we measure total national output, GDP. Instead of employment in one industry, we track the national unemployment rate. And this is where things become much more complicated. Macroeconomists realized something important. Prices and wages do not always adjust quickly, especially wages. During recessions, firms often do not cut wages immediately. Instead, they reduce hiring or lay off workers entirely. This creates persistent unemployment and prolonged economic slowdowns. In other words, what works smoothly at the small scale does not always work smoothly for the economy as a whole. That realization gave birth to macroeconomics as a separate field. Microeconomists primarily use supply and demand analysis. Macroeconomists use aggregate supply and aggregate demand models to study nationwide behavior. And ultimately, macroeconomics focuses on three giant goals: high economic growth, low unemployment, stable inflation, Understanding this distinction is crucial because policies that help one business may not help the entire economy and sometimes can even make things worse at the national level. Now let's move into two ideas that form the backbone of macroeconomics. The first is sticky prices. Sticky prices are prices that do not adjust quickly to changes in supply and demand. And the most important sticky price in the economy is wages. Imagine a recession begins. Consumers spend less. Businesses earn lower revenues. In theory, wages should simply fall until firms can afford to keep everyone employed. But in reality, that rarely happens. Why? Because cutting wages creates serious problems. Employee morale falls, productivity declines, workers quit, unions resist cuts, and contracts may legally prevent immediate reductions. So, instead of lowering wages, firms often lay off workers, and that is one of the central reasons unemployment rises during recessions. This idea completely changed economics in the 20th century. Economists realized labor markets behave very differently from textbook supply and demand diagrams. Now, the second concept, aggregate behavior. The word aggregate simply means combined total. Aggregate output means the total value of all goods and services produced in the economy. Aggregate consumption means total household spending. Aggregate investment means total business spending on factories, machines, research, and technology. Here's what makes macroeconomics fascinating. Each individual person or company makes decisions independently. But when millions of those decisions happen simultaneously, they create massive economy-wide effects. One company cutting workers may not matter much, but thousands of firms doing it together can trigger a recession. One household saving more money seems responsible, but if everyone suddenly cuts spending at the same time, businesses lose revenue and the economy slows down. This interaction between millions of independent decisions is what macroeconomics tries to understand. Now we arrive at the heart of macroeconomics, the business cycle. Governments and central banks care deeply about three major concerns: economic growth, unemployment, inflation, and these goals often conflict with each other. For example, stimulating growth too aggressively may create inflation. Reducing inflation too aggressively may increase unemployment. This balancing act is one of the hardest challenges in economic policy. Now look carefully at this graph. The wavy line represents actual aggregate output, the real performance of the economy over time. The straight trend line represents long-term economic growth. Notice something important. The economy does not grow smoothly. Instead, it moves in cycles. At the bottom, we have the weakest point of economic activity. From bottom to peak, the economy enters an expansion or boom, where production rises, businesses hire more workers, consumer confidence improves, investment increases, and incomes grow. Eventually, the economy reaches a peak, the highest point in the cycle. After that comes contraction or recession. Output falls, businesses slow production, layoffs rise, and spending weakens. A recession is commonly defined as 2 consecutive quarters of declining output. A depression is far more severe and prolonged, like the Great Depression of the 1930s. But notice another important insight. Despite short-term crashes and recessions, economies historically tend to grow over the long run. That long-run upward trend is one of the defining characteristics of modern economic development. This chart tells the economic story of the United States across more than a century. At first glance, the long-term trend is incredibly powerful. The economy grew from just a few $100 billion in output to well over $14 trillion by 2009. That represents enormous increases in productivity, technology, industrialization, education, infrastructure, and living standards. But look closer, and you'll notice something equally important. The path was never smooth. Economic history is filled with shocks. You can clearly see the collapse during the Great Depression of the 1930s, one of the worst economic disasters in modern history. Banks failed, businesses shut down, unemployment exploded. Then notice the dramatic surge during World War II. War production massively increased industrial output and employment. Moving forward, the 1970s brought oil shocks and inflationary pressure. Energy prices surged globally, creating economic instability. The early 1980s recession appears next, driven largely by aggressive interest rate hikes used to control inflation. And finally, the sharp decline during the 2008 to 2009 global financial crisis reminds us how dangerous financial instability can become. Housing markets collapsed, major banks failed, global credit froze. What this chart teaches us is simple but powerful. Economic growth is real, but instability is also real. Every generation experiences its own economic challenges, and macroeconomics helps us understand why these disruptions happen and how governments attempt to respond. Now let's discuss one of the most human aspects of macroeconomics, unemployment. Behind every unemployment statistic is a real person, a real family, and a real financial struggle. That's why unemployment is not just an economic issue, it's also a social and political issue. First, let's define the labor force. The labor force includes people who are employed and people actively searching for work. If someone has stopped looking for a job entirely, they are no longer counted as unemployed in official statistics. Historically, unemployment rates have fluctuated dramatically. During the Great Depression in 1933, unemployment in the United States reached nearly 25%. Imagine 1 out of every 4 workers unable to find employment. During the 2008 to 2009 financial crisis, unemployment climbed close to 10%. But before that crisis, unemployment had fallen to around 3.5%, which economists considered extremely strong labor market conditions. Now let's understand the 4 major types of unemployment. First, frictional unemployment. This is normal and healthy. People changing jobs, recent graduates entering the workforce, or workers relocating to better opportunities. Second, structural unemployment. This happens when workers' skills no longer match available jobs. For example, automation replacing factory workers or coal industry decline, reducing mining employment. Entire industries can disappear due to technological change. Third, cyclical unemployment, the most important for macroeconomics. This occurs during recessions. When consumer spending falls, businesses reduce production. As production falls, firms lay off workers and unemployment rises across the economy. Finally, seasonal unemployment. Certain industries naturally fluctuate during different times of the year: tourism, agriculture, holiday retail, construction, and others. Now look at this historical unemployment graph. Notice how unemployment spikes sharply during recessions. Economists often consider around 4 to 5% unemployment to represent full employment because frictional unemployment always exists in a healthy economy. And here's the key macroeconomic insight. If wages adjusted perfectly downward, unemployment should theoretically disappear, but wages are sticky. Workers resist pay cuts. Firms avoid reducing salaries. As a result, labor markets may not clear quickly, and unemployment can persist for long periods. This is exactly why governments and central banks intervene aggressively during recessions. Now we move to another central concern of macroeconomics: inflation. Inflation simply means a sustained increase in the overall price level across the economy. In simple terms, your money gradually buys fewer goods and services over time. A small amount of inflation, around 2% annually, is generally considered healthy because it encourages spending, investment, and economic activity. But when inflation becomes too high, serious problems emerge. Now look at this inflation chart. Notice how inflation remained relatively moderate during the mid-1960s. But during the 1970s, inflation accelerated dramatically, eventually peaking near 14% in 1980. This period became one of the most economically difficult decades in modern US history. Oil prices surged, Production costs increased, consumer prices skyrocketed. Now let's talk about the extreme version, hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is not just high inflation, it is complete monetary chaos. One of the most famous examples occurred in Bolivia during the 1980s. Inflation reached roughly 2000% annually. Prices changed so quickly that businesses sometimes updated prices multiple times in a single day. Imagine this, the price of an egg rising from 3000 pesos to 10,000 pesos in only 1 week. Savings become worthless, contracts become meaningless, planning becomes impossible. Entire economies can break down under hyperinflation. Now, interestingly, deflation, falling prices, can also be dangerous. At first, lower prices sound beneficial, but deflation creates a major problem. People delay purchases because they expect prices to fall even further. Businesses then earn less revenue, production slows, layoffs rise, and the economy weakens further. That creates a vicious cycle. Now look at how inflation affects different groups differently. Retirees and fixed income earners lose purchasing power. Savers and lenders suffer because inflation reduces the real value of money. Borrowers often benefit because they repay debt with cheaper money. Governments may temporarily benefit because inflation reduces the real burden of debt. And businesses face uncertainty because future costs become harder to predict. This is why central banks around the world focus so intensely on inflation control. Too little inflation can weaken growth. Too much inflation can destabilize the economy. Managing that balance is one of the hardest tasks in macroeconomics. Now let's step back and look at the economy as one connected system. Macroeconomists divide the economy into four major sectors: households, firms, government, rest of the world. And the circular flow diagram helps us visualize how all these sectors interact continuously. This is one of the most important foundational models in economics. Let's walk through it carefully. Households provide labor to firms and government institutions. In return, they receive wages, salaries, interest, rent, and dividends. Households then spend part of that income purchasing goods and services produced by firms. Firms receive this revenue and use it to pay workers, invest in machinery, expand operations, and generate profits. The government enters the flow through taxation and spending. It collects taxes from households and firms and injects money back into the economy through infrastructure, healthcare, education, defense, pensions, and transfer payments like social security. And finally, we have the rest of the world. Countries import goods and services from abroad while also exporting products to foreign consumers. So money continuously moves in and out through global trade. Now here's the most important principle on this slide. Everyone's expenditure is someone else's income. When you buy a phone, your spending becomes revenue for a business. When businesses pay wages, that income becomes household purchasing power. When governments spend money on infrastructure, construction companies and workers receive income. The economy is essentially one giant interconnected flow of payments. Now notice two important ideas. Savings are called leakages because money temporarily leaves the spending flow. Investment and government spending are injections because they add spending back into the system. For the economy to remain stable over time, leakages and injections must roughly balance. Now let's organize the entire economy into three major market arenas. Every economic activity ultimately takes place in one of these three systems. First, the goods and services market. This is where firms produce and sell products. Households buy consumer goods, governments purchase public services, and firms buy machinery and equipment from other firms. This market also includes international trade, exports and imports. Second, the labor market. This is where households supply labor and firms and governments hire workers. And today, labor markets are increasingly globalized. A company in the United States may outsource customer support to India, manufacturing to Vietnam, or software development to Eastern Europe. Technology has made labor markets far more internationally connected than ever before. Third, the money or financial market. This is where savings are transformed into investment. Households supply funds through banks, savings, pension funds, and investments. Firms and governments borrow those funds to finance expansion and spending. Now let's look at some major financial instruments. Treasury securities are considered among the safest investments because they are backed by the government. Corporate bonds are riskier because companies can fail. Shares of stock represent partial ownership in a company. Investors earn returns through dividends, capital gains, interest payments, and one variable connects all financial markets: interest rates. Interest rates reflect risk, loan maturity, inflation expectations, and overall economic conditions. That's why financial markets react instantly whenever central banks change interest rates. Finally, we arrive at one of the most powerful forces in macroeconomics: government policy. Modern economies are not left entirely on their own. Governments and central banks actively intervene to stabilize growth, reduce unemployment, and control inflation. They mainly use two tools: fiscal policy and monetary policy. Let's begin with fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is controlled by elected governments, Congress, Parliament, and the executive branch. It involves decisions about taxation, government spending. Governments collect revenue through income taxes, payroll taxes, corporate taxes, and other sources. That money is then spent on infrastructure, healthcare, education, defense, public transportation, social welfare, and more. Now, depending on economic conditions, governments can change fiscal policy direction. Expansionary fiscal policy means cutting taxes, increasing spending, or both. The goal is to stimulate demand during recessions. Contractionary fiscal policy does the opposite, raising taxes or reducing spending to cool inflation. Now let's move to monetary policy. In the United States, monetary policy is controlled by the Federal Reserve, commonly called the Fed. The Fed controls the money supply and strongly influences interest rates throughout the economy. Its major tools include open market operations, federal funds rate, reserve requirements, discount rate, quantitative easing. During crises like 2008 to 2009, the Fed injected enormous liquidity into the financial system to prevent economic collapse. Now compare fiscal and monetary policy side by side. Fiscal policy is often politically slower because governments debate budgets and legislation. Monetary policy can move faster because central banks can change interest rates relatively quickly. Both policies influence growth, inflation, employment, borrowing, investment, and financial markets. And in major crises, governments often use both simultaneously. We've covered a tremendous amount today, so let's bring everything together. Macroeconomics studies the economy as a whole. Unlike microeconomics, which focuses on individual markets, macroeconomics examines nationwide output, unemployment, inflation, and economic stability. We explored the three major concerns of policymakers: economic growth, unemployment, inflation. We learned how business cycles create expansions and recessions, and why economies fluctuate around long-run growth trends. We examined unemployment, inflation, deflation, and hyperinflation, and saw how sticky wages and prices can create prolonged economic instability. We explored the circular flow model and understood how households, firms, governments, and the rest of the world are deeply interconnected. We also studied the three major market arenas: goods markets, labor markets, and financial markets. And finally, we analyzed how governments attempt to stabilize economies through fiscal policy and monetary policy. At its core, macroeconomics is really about managing trade-offs. High growth can sometimes create inflation. Reducing inflation can sometimes increase unemployment. Balancing these competing goals is one of the greatest challenges faced by policymakers around the world. And that is exactly why macroeconomics remains one of the most important subjects in economics, finance, business, and public policy. Thank you very much for joining me today. If you found this session valuable, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the True Analyst with others interested in understanding economics and the world around them. I'll see you in the next session.